Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled NACOE Local Government Heavy Vehicle Route Assessment Guidelines, Risk Assessment and Traffic Considerations. Next slide, please. My name is Isabella and I'm moderating the session today. Next slide, please. We plan to go for 60 minutes with time for questions. Next slide, please. We'd love to have your input. So you see here on the slide how to send your questions through. Now we're all following the government guidelines and all coming from our home offices. So fingers crossed our technology works. And we also have Neva and Rosie from ARB joining in for technology support. Next slide, please. So our presenter today is Kieran Hay, Senior Professional Engineer, Transport Safety, ARRB. Next slide, please. We also have two guest presenters today who are available for questions throughout. They are David Milling, Team Leader, Transport Safety, ARRB, Larry Griffiths, Principal Engineer, Road Manager Policy, Heavy Vehicles and Prosecution, Department of Transport and Main Roads. Okay, let's get started and we'll now be hearing from Kieran.
Thanks, Isabella. Great intro there. Yeah, I just want to quickly thank Dave and Larry for joining in on this to answer any questions that come their way. So, as you all know, this is a 5-part webinar series that's aimed at conveying the new guidance presented in the guidelines. And we did our first session yesterday, so hopefully most of you were in for that. And yesterday we were talking about the introduction to the guides, what they are, how to use them. And we also looked at those route assessment tables and the route assessment form tools that we had created as well. So today we're going to be looking more at the risk assessment process and the traffic considerations that make up part of the guidelines. And this table here just also shows what's coming up in the next couple of sessions and what the dates are for those. So this slide just shows an overview of what sections in the guidelines we'll be covering in this webinar session. And as I mentioned before, it's mainly focused around risk assessment processes and traffic considerations. So each of these sections has new guidance in them in comparison to other existing guides. And during this webinar, we'll touch on each of the sections. So the key additions that are being covered is the risk assessment process to granting access, and a bit of updated guidance for traffic considerations. So I guess first of all, what is risk assessment processes and how does it work? So the route assessment guideline is a guide only, and exceptions to this guide can be made, and we've put this section in that guide to really show how you can do that and how you can do that in a safe way. So road managers can use their expert judgment to determine if something that falls outside the guidelines is safe and whether it's possible to grant access for that. So the risk assessment process enables consideration of risk-based access, allowing road managers to capture attributes that don't meet the guidelines and determine if access is able to be granted. It's all about identifying what risks would be present if those guidelines aren't met, and what the likelihood and severity of this risk is, what mitigating treatments are available, and finally, whether the level of risk that's identified is acceptable for that road manager. And we'll talk more about this as we go, and we've got some examples towards the end of the slide, towards the end of the session. So this framework is quite broad, and we've made that intentionally so that road managers are able to adopt and modify this framework, if they want to. I guess in the end, it's really up to the road manager on whether they want to adopt this risk management process or risk assessment process. And if they do adopt it, they're not locked into one way of doing it. I guess risk assessment is quite a broad topic, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. So this just provides a framework that kind of gets you started, and then you can modify and go from there. So the risk assessment process, like I said before, if a route attribute doesn't meet the criteria in the guidelines, we can use this process to, I guess, identify risks and work out if it's safe to provide access or not. So it's, I guess, in the end, the main goal is to minimize safety risks and maximize positive outcomes. So I guess in this case, positive outcomes is productivity and I guess the economic gains from providing access. So the risk assessment process that we've used in the guide is from the ISO 31000 or 31000. And it's the risk management process from that document. So it basically shows a cyclical process for risk management, and risk management doesn't stop once you come up with those mitigating treatments. It does require revision and monitoring to ensure that those treatments are working as intended, and if they're not, further work is required there to I guess either revert what you did or come up with new changes to maintain the level of safety that you originally intended. So in the image on the right there, we can see that the risk assessment section itself, which is that center square, is broken into 3 sections. So you've got risk identification and risk analysis and risk evaluation. So we'll talk about those 3 parts in a little bit more detail afterwards. All right, so in the guide, we've provided this risk assessment or risk management framework for heavy vehicle route evaluation. And you can see that each step shows the applicable sections in the guideline. So as an example, step 1, establishing the context, it does point you to the sections of the guide that would help you out doing that step. So in this case, section 3, which is looking at vehicle types, and then also section 9, which is looking at traffic and crashes. So it is there to assist you in undertaking this process. So the framework is there to provide a simple and consistent methodology or approach to the risk assessment. And the 4 main steps are establishing the context, so what vehicle types are used, the traffic considerations, basic information about the route, the risk assessment process, which is determining any risks for geometry, structures, pavements, amenities, anything like that. Risk treatment, which is applying conditions or mitigating measures to reduce that level of risk that was identified. Monitoring and review, which is then, is the risk acceptable and have those treatments actually mitigated that risk? So this process was originally developed in response to a need for clarity in the risk-based decision-making of the route. And it's aimed at removing ambiguity around that and enabling a balanced approach for improving productivity by recognizing and quantifying risks to the road manager. So it provides a risk evaluation method to prioritize risk treatment options throughout access conditions. And it really empowers local governments and local councils to accept a reasonably practical risk. So we're just going to be talking about a little bit more in depth around what's going on in each of these sections of that risk management process. So from the flow chart from the previous slide, we know that the first step of the risk assessment process was to establish the context around what's happening on that route. So this is done by clearly defining the objective and scope of assessing a certain vehicle type on a particular length of road. And you can see that in that table on the right there. It's got basic information, what the contextual factor is, and then also what the value is. So obviously this is just sample data in there to kind of guide you on what to put in where. or what data you should be collecting. And we've got a good example of this later in the slide where we'll actually go through and show what information to put in there based on a certain route assessment. So this includes collecting information about the route, vehicle types, productivity, and traffic interactions, and understanding the traffic composition, crash history, and traffic volume variations. As you may know, volume isn't always static, and in certain peak times, it may increase or decrease. So the second step in the framework is undertaking that risk assessment. So this step itself is broken up into, I guess, three main parts. So this is risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. So the next couple of slides will just talk about that in a little bit more detail. So this slide here is all about identifying risks on the route you're assessing. So you can use the guide to identify areas where characteristics or attributes of that route do not meet the requirements within the guidelines, and then you can identify these as risks to mitigate later. So as you're going through your route assessment, just because one thing doesn't quite meet the criteria, doesn't mean that you just have to stop the assessment there and call it quits. You can add that to a list, continue with your assessment, and then at the end, try and come up with mitigating measures to allow access if that's what you're wanting to do. So I guess the aim of this phase of the risk assessment process is to list out all your risks or hazards that have been identified on that route. And this should identify the source of the risk, the area of impact, causes, and potential consequences of those risks. And you should also be, you should also consider what's called knock-on effects. So if you implement one mitigating factor, that mitigating factor could then lead to another risk that wasn't already present. So there is a little bit of extra consideration that goes into this, and that should always be looked at and considered. A good example of that is if you install signage or traffic signals, then the knock-on effect could be changes to traffic, such as traffic congestion, and then that could lead to risk of more rear-end crashes. So there is those knock-on effects that do need to be considered. And identification of risks really requires up-to-date information about that route or that area, and people with the appropriate knowledge to be able to identify those risks. So it does take that engineering judgment to really be able to do this effectively. So the next part of that risk assessment process is risk analysis. So this is really analysing what those risks that you've identified mean. So when undertaking a risk analysis, we need to consider the likelihood of an event occurring and also the severity of that event if we were to provide access. So using the severity and likelihood, we're able to evaluate the level of risk using the matrix on the right. So this is a matrix that's included in the guidelines themselves. And you're able to use that matrix to then determine what the level of risk is based on that event occurring. So as an example here, if we had a risk that was identified and we know that the likelihood of that risk occurring is relatively likely, and the severity of that risk is quite major, then we would be able to use this matrix to identify that the level of risk involved is quite high. So if we were to do mitigating treatments, and this is something that we would want to really mitigate first before most other risks, unless we had risks that are catastrophic and or that are extreme. Sorry. So this process can be undertaken for the existing scenario, so before access is granted, and then also for the scenario if access is granted. So this will kind of create a bit of a baseline for comparison, and it'll like allow you to then work out what the change in risk is. And the last part of that risk assessment process is the risk evaluation. So this is looking at what treatment options are available. So the approach to treatment is based on the risk rating from the last slide. So obviously we want to be treating extreme risks earlier than low risks, as they're the most extreme. So examples of this risk management process will be given throughout the webinar. So we will show, I guess, how to do this, and those treatment options identified in the IS 31000 for each risk rating outcome. So in the table on the right there, so this is from the IS 31000. It shows what the risk rating is, what treatment approach should be used for that risk, and then also what treatment options there are. So for example, if you do come across a risk which is quite extreme, then your treatment approach is to avoid that risk. And by doing that, your treatment option is to either remove the risk source or avoid the risk by deciding not to start or continue with the activity. So as an example of that, you know, if lane widths are too narrow or something like that, the removal would be to actually not remove the road, but to actually increase the size of the road so that the risk of crashes is removed or lessened. And then I guess the avoid the risk would be not putting those vehicles on the road because the road can't accommodate it. So this is looking at the risk treatment, and this kind of follows on a little bit from the last slide. So it's looking at the approach used when treating a risk. So as I said before, this is based on that risk rating. So should a risk be identified to have a risk rating of extreme or high, then the attribute that did not meet the guidelines should be investigated in more detail. And usually with those levels of risk, it typically requires an engineering-based remedial work to be undertaken to enable that access. So should a risk be identified to have a risk rating of medium, the suggested mitigation treatments in the guide or other mitigation treatments may be applied to reduce the risk. The risk assessment process should then be reconducted to identify the change in risk rating. And if a risk rating of low is identified, the risk could be accepted or mitigation treatments could be put in place. So for example, if a risk is extremely unlikely, yes, that risk is there, but it may be that it's so low that the risk is not great enough to stop access, I suppose. So throughout the risk treatment process, the principles for treating risk should be followed. So these are shown on the right here. And it's basically balancing the costs and efforts of treatment, prioritizing more severe risks first, involving and communicating with key stakeholders. So that's quite an important one, which is, you know, sometimes forgotten. And recognizing that treatments can introduce secondary risks, which is also quite important. You know, if you go about, I suppose, treating an extreme or high risk with some sort of engineering treatment, so realignment of a road, it could be that realignment then introduces additional risks that you would then have to identify and treat. And we will talk about this a little bit more in some of the examples. So the last step in that risk management process is monitoring and review. So this step is used to ensure that the control measures or mitigating measures that were used to modify that risk are effective and efficient in design and operation. So if you do use a mitigating measure and it has no effect on the actual risk, or it isn't doing it as well as you intended, then that treatment is essentially not working, and it needs to be reviewed and it needs to be updated so that it does, meet the level of performance that you had originally intended. And also understanding the roles and responsibility of stakeholders and the extent of heavy vehicle networks helps to determine changes in context, and identify lessons learned and emerging risks. So just because you've done that risk assessment once doesn't mean that it's always going to stay the same. It could be that changes in the environment or increases in heavy vehicle traffic or just volume in general may change that risk. It might increase the likelihood of some risks or increase the severity. So it is something where you would need to be double checking that on a regular basis to ensure that those treatments are still working. And I guess if no treatments were put in place, to ensure that that risk hasn't increased in severity. So that's just a brief overview of I guess what that risk assessment process is, and the process itself is quite involved. So obviously we can't tell you every single detail about it, but we have detailed it quite in depth in the guideline. And like I said before, it is something where road managers can go in and they can either choose to adopt that method that we put in there or that framework that we've put in there and then modify that where needed. Or it could be as simple as you find your own risk assessment process that you want to use. I guess in the end, it's really up to you on which way you go about that. And like I said before, there are a few different risk management processes out there that are available to use. And I guess it's really finding the one that works for your council or road authority. And as long as it's providing that level of safety and yes, yeah, as long as it's providing good safety benefits, then that's the main thing. So I'll just pause there briefly and see if we've got any questions. I know that risk assessment it's quite in depth, so we didn't get to cover off everything here. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat now, and we'll try and answer a few of them before we move on to a couple of examples.
Perfect. Thanks, Kieran. We've got one from Adam, and they've asked, new road systems will not have identified traffic characteristics or changing traffic, as well as not having crash data due to short period of road opening and changing traffic. Please comment.
So I guess with that one, for new roads, you should have an estimate on what the volume would be. Yes, you definitely won't have crash data that to really provide certain types of risks. However, there are risks that can be identified without having that data anyway. I don't know if Dave has a bit more information in that. I know he's more across road design than I am, so I'm sure he'll be able to provide a bit of info there.
Yeah, certainly, Kieran. I guess my comment for that would be we're probably at the stage with our road network where we won't be designing and building a road that's completely unique to any surrounding roads. So it would be a case of looking at your surrounding roads, identifying some roads with a similar function, cross-section and traffic composition, identifying what the risks are on those roads with regards to historical crashes, and trying to foresee what possible issues you may come across, and just ensuring that those are inherently covered by the criteria that's within the guideline. that would be the way that I'd approach that.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. And yeah, that's a good follow-up to what I mentioned. Any other questions in there, Isabella?
Yeah, we've got one from Emily, and they have asked, how does the hierarchy of controls impact the risk assessment to put an HV on a certain route? i.e., elimination is the highest mitigation treatment, but this is not necessarily practical. How is this documented?
Yeah, so I guess in the end, it really comes back to that those principles that we talked about. I'll see if I can just find the slide real quick. And it's about balancing, yeah, the costs and efforts of treatment. And obviously, if there is a treatment where it does require things like major works on a road to treat a certain risk, then in a lot of cases that may not be viable, and it may be that the council just doesn't have the money to do so. And I guess that really just needs to be documented. Yeah, to show that it's just not a viable treatment at the time. Yeah, hopefully that's answered the question. Yeah.
Kieran, I might just give it.
Hopefully I've understood that question.
Yeah, I might just chip in and give a couple of examples. So, say for instance, if you had a heavy vehicle rest area that currently had stopping bay lengths that could contain a PBS level 2B, and you wanted to put a 3A on. So while the bay lengths may not strictly cater for that, if you were to eliminate that risk, you'd extend the length of the bay. If you were to substitute that risk, then you might identify that perhaps you need to put some temporary measures in place until you could come and provide it. So there's an option within the risk matrix to accept a lower order of treatment, but you should monitor the performance of that. And if it's not performing well, then you can go back to your original decision, which is that it's not in line with the criteria, or there might be a demonstration that you have some improvements in a program of works, and you've accepted that there is a risk, but it's not as such of a high risk that you can't then provide access. So there's an ongoing monitoring process that's involved as well.
Awesome, thanks, Dave.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Kieran. We currently don't have any more questions at the moment, so let's keep moving.
Awesome, perfect. Just get back to where it was. All right. So as I mentioned before, we do have some examples in future webinars. So throughout the webinar series, we'll be providing examples of route assessments where geometric attributes haven't met the recommended values in the guidelines. And in that, we undertake a short risk assessment process to mitigate some of those risks involved. So they are just some quick examples throughout the series just to show how this process can be used. For today, we'll mainly be looking at a bit of a broad example of the risk assessment process. But yeah, do look forward to those examples in the future sessions. So the example that we're looking at today is just the example where a PBS level 2A vehicle is operating on a local road, and we're just doing a quick risk assessment to identify some risks involved and treat those risks. So as before, the assessment process is to establish the context, undertake the risk assessment process, determine the risk treatments and residual risk considerations, and then monitor and review the risk for the treatments. So the first step is to, like I said, establish that context. So this can include, some basic information about the route, traffic composition, crash history, variations in traffic volumes, what type of vehicle we're using, anything like that. It's really anything that's relevant to that situation. So as I mentioned before, we're looking at a PBS level 2A vehicle operating on a network. And I've put in just some sample values here, if it pops up. There we go. So some of the basic information that we've got in here is, what roads are we on? what road type. So it's a 2-lane sealed road. You know, what the carriageway is, that kind of stuff. You know, what the speed limit is in that area. The class of vehicle, the length, width, height, anything like that. What our traffic composition is. So for this example, you know, we've estimated a percentage of heavy vehicles as 5% of the AADT. Our AADT is only 1,000, and you know, we've said we haven't identified any crash patterns, you know, in the area. So that's really establishing the context. It's any information that may help you to identify risks throughout that process. And Section 3 and Section 9 of the guideline does provide some more information on this and what kind of information you may require when you're going through this process. So this is just a bit of a sample data set here for the purpose of this risk assessment example. So then the second step of that process is to assess the potential risks that are involved. So it includes the risk identification, analysis, and evaluation that we discussed earlier in the presentation. So we've identified some of our risks as shown in the table here. So we've identified what the key consideration is, what the safety risk or hazard is, and then also a description of that. So the very first one that we have is a geometry issue. It's unsafe turning at an intersection. And then there's the possibility of an over-dimensioned vehicle damaging roadside infrastructure and increasing crash risk to other road users. So in this case, the over-dimensional vehicle, it's not necessarily oversized. It's that heavy vehicle, so the PBS level 2A vehicle, which is, I guess, oversized in comparison to what's currently on the network. And then we've also got a couple of other risks that have been identified for structures, pavements, and amenities there. So now that we've identified our risks, we now need to undergo the risk analysis and risk evaluation section of the process. So these two processes allow us to determine the risk rating and the treatment approach. So the risk rating, again, is based on the likelihood of an event occurring and severity of that event. So we've gone through and done that, which you'll see on the next slide. This just shows what that matrix looks like again. So you use the top table to determine your risk rating, and then you use the bottom table to essentially see what treatment approaches you should be using. So in this example, the risk rating of E is extreme, so it's a critical concern that must be addressed and it requires changes to avoid serious consequences. The H is high risk, so that's a significant concern that should be addressed and requires changes to avoid major consequences. So back on extreme, so extreme would be, I guess, fatality or life-threatening and complete failure. High risk would be injury, damage, financial loss, and public concerns. The M is moderate risk, so moderate concern that should be addressed by a planned action. And then low risk is just minor concern that should be addressed by routine procedures. And again, we've got the what treatment approach you should use, so risk avoidance, transfer, mitigation, or acceptance, and then also an example of the treatment options. And there are more treatment options than this. These are just the ones that are recommended through that ISO 31000 document, which is what we've adopted as part of our framework. All right, so we can now apply the risk analysis process on each of our risks. So what we've done here is we've taken those risks that we saw earlier, so our geometry, structure, pavement, and amenities risks, and we've determined what our risk ratings are. So for the very first one, the unsafe turning at an intersection, we've determined that the likelihood of that happening is likely, but the severity in this case is minor. So it has come out with an outcome of medium or moderate, I should say. Whilst there's a couple of others where there's things like the amenity risk, where risk of the PBS operator not adhering to approved routes. So the likelihood of that happening is likely, and the severity could be major. It really depends on the situation. So it does have a high risk there. And some risks will obviously be higher than others, and some of them are quite situational. So yeah, using the risk evaluation table, we can determine what treatment approach we should employ. So if we're talking about the geometry key consideration there, it's a moderate risk, so we should it should be addressed by risk mitigation. And we'll see a bit of an example on that on the next page. So risk mitigation is really just changing the likelihood or changing the consequences of that risk. So the third step in that risk assessment process is to treat the risks and consider the residual risks. So we should follow the principles for treating risks to ensure the best treatment is chosen. And again, that's balancing the costs and requirements of treatment implementation to select the most appropriate option against the benefits obtained. We need to prioritize the treatment of the more severe risks based on a risk analysis matrix and a treatment evaluation model outlined in the guideline. Involve and communicate with key stakeholders in the decision when risk treatment options are identified, and recognize that risk treatment can also introduce secondary risks, which should be assessed, treated, monitored, and reviewed. So imposing the conditions of consent relating to vehicle and travel characteristics coupled with infrastructure upgrade requirements is considered a primary measure to mitigate the recognised risks. So examples of consent conditions are included in the guideline as well. So there is that option available. All right, so here we've now come up with some treatments for those risks that we identified, and these aren't the only treatments that we could have gone with. This is just an example of what can be done. There is quite a wide range of treatments available. So as an example, for the unsafe turning in an intersection, the treatment could be as simple as undertaking a swept path analysis to just confirm the extent of intersection modifications, or to just ensure that safe turning is available. It could be that was considered a risk, but once a swept path was undertaken, it could have turned out that there actually wasn't an issue there. Or it could be that modifications were required to the intersection. That one, again, is a bit situational. In regard to the structure one, it could be imposing an access condition to restrict vehicle speed over a bridge or a structure, or have a maximum mass when traveling over a bridge or structure, and that's to reduce the risk of damage or failure to that bridge. For pavement, so risk of pavement damage or failure, so cost attribution based on the marginal cost principles. So you can undertake that process, and we'll talk about that a little bit in, I believe it's session 5. But yeah, it's basically just ensuring that any vehicles that are put on the road don't have any negative impacts, and if they do, what are the risks there, or what are the costs involved. And finally, the amenity issue, so PBS operator not adhering to approved routes. So imposing an access condition for the consent holder to enrol in IAP, or the Intelligent Access Program, So that provides positional tracking and record keeping information to road managers. So that's an option that can be taken or can be imposed on a permit or a notice or anything like that, so that road managers can ensure that those vehicles don't leave the approved permit or the approved roads. So again, that's just some examples of what treatments can be implemented for safety risks. And we can see here that we've now undertaken our risk rating again based on those treatments that we've implemented. And it's in every case, it's changed either the likelihood or the severity. And in changing one or both of those, it's then reduced our risk rating outcome. So now all of these are classified as low. And then the final part of that risk management process is really to ensure that the control measures that we use to modify those risks are effective and efficient. And if our treatments are not effective, then they aren't providing any benefit and the risk really hasn't been reduced. So treatments should be checked on a regular basis to ensure they are working. And as an example of this, so if we did do a swept path analysis and it did say that, you know, that intersection was fine to be used by that type of vehicle, and then it turns out that, I don't know, the swept path was done incorrectly, or vehicles aren't using the turning path that you accounted for, then it turns out that that treatment then wasn't effective. So the outcome or the risk rating outcome wasn't actually lowered at all. So it is critical to really go back and ensure that those treatments that were put in place are working as intended. And again, things like, you know, IAP, if the owner doesn't put IAP into the vehicle, well, it's not really effective. And again, the bridge one, if people are still traveling over that, you know, with higher masses, or they're not abiding by that speed limit, it's not effective. So it is something that does need to be monitored. In almost all cases, I'm sure these would be fine. But yeah, it is something that needs to be monitored and reviewed regularly to ensure that those treatments are still working. And if they're not, then new treatments need to be implemented instead. So I'll just open up for a few questions about, you know, that example, or just really the risk management process in general. And then we'll finish off on a bit of information about traffic considerations that's included in the guidelines.
Thanks, Kieran. We've got a question from Tony, and they've asked, is there any intention to build a risk assessment process into the route assessment tools, or is this a separate option outside the current tools provided?
So right now, I'm not sure if we've had any thoughts on really doing that. Not that I know of. I'd have to check with Dave to see if there is any intention to do that. However, with the framework being so broad and risk assessment being able to be undertaken in many different ways, it would be difficult to, I guess, lock people into one specific way of managing those risks. I guess if it is something that everyone wants, it could be considered, but I guess it's really up to, I guess, NACOE whether they decide to implement that into the tools. Dave, do you know if there's any intention to do that, or if I guess you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I might just provide a thought, and then after that I might hand to Larry for comment as well. So, look, it was a discussion that we had, but we recognise that anything that we did produce would have to be fluid, in recognition that different local governments will accept different levels of risk. However, so the intent of providing the framework and the guide was to provide some level of consistency, so that there was a consistent process and decisions were being documented. But look, it is something that we could if there was a demand, we could put into an electronic format. And certainly if there's some stakeholders there from local government, probably the best people to get in contact with about that would be through Susan Barlow, myself or Larry. So just be in touch. And Larry, did you have anything to add on that?
Oh, great. I had muted myself. So, no, David, I think you've covered it fairly well. In the course of providing route assessment training to the TMR districts, the lack of addressing of risk assessments has actually been highlighted. So this is something that over the course of the next year or so, I intend to start incorporating into our own route assessment training and guidelines. But I'll obviously be chatting a fair bit with you, David, on this type of topic.
Yep, definitely. So it sounds like the departments facing the same challenges, and there might be some overlap where we can provide some benefits to local government once that evolves.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect, thanks guys. We have another question from Emma Lee, and they have asked, are the likelihood and severity prescriptive under ISO 9001, i.e. likelihood, once every 5 years is unlikely, etc., or is this more subjective? And if so, how do you ensure consistency across applications and assessors?
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure if the IS 31000 provides I guess a level of detail on how you would determine what's likely and what's not. That document, I guess, is quite broad and it can be applied to any industry really. So it would be quite hard for them to really lock down a specific identifier for what's likely and what's unlikely. Obviously, in the transport industry, a crash may be more unlikely than in a different industry where a tripping risk is more likely, kind of thing. That was not a great example, I know. But yeah, so I think in this case, with the risk assessment process, the likelihood is quite subjective to whoever is doing that assessment. And I guess in a lot of cases, it'd be more beneficial to have one person doing the likelihood and severities if possible. That way it is quite consistent. I know obviously that is not the case in a lot of situations, but yeah, I suppose it is unfortunately a bit of a subjective thing. I don't know if Dave knows of any documents that really identify likelihood indicators and what the likelihood is.
Yeah, look, I guess my view on that is it is a little bit subjective. So whilst the Australian standards identify how frequent the frequency of an event is likely, unlikely, likely, imminent, all those sorts of categories. I perhaps would look at it with a broader lens. So when we're looking at some of the issues that you might consider on a route assessment, if you've got a narrow section of road, well then how frequent a run-off road crash might happen is dependent on the traffic volume and the number of heavy vehicles. So your definition of likely or unlikely might differ between roads just based on those volumes. So there's that, and then also too, the risk assessment process is covering other events as well. So pavement deterioration and structures. So I think it's really there as a framework and as a good starting base. And then I think as you get through the detail and start to evolve that process, it'll become evident. And we'd be happy. Well, as Kieran mentioned yesterday, we have funding for this financial year to be involved in providing assistance. So certainly keep us in the loop in that journey, and we can probably provide some advice on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I think Dave made a good point there. Is the likelihood of one event occurring could be, I suppose, very different to the likelihood of another event. something like, a fatality occurring is, the frequency of that occurring is a lot less than the frequency of, maybe someone running off a road. And yeah, especially with differences between pavements and geometry, I guess the frequency of pavement damage would be like very different to the frequency of a traffic crash occurring, and it's not something that can really be quantified at the same level. So it is subjective, and it is, I guess, as a situation-based kind of thing, on a situational level. Yeah. Isabella, any other questions there?
Yeah, we've got one from Paul, and they've asked, is there a list of vehicle type / recommended situations where IAP enrolment conditions would be suitable?
Yeah, so in the document, I don't believe so. And that's, I guess, something that's not really covered under this guideline itself. That's more of it's really a state-by-state kind of consideration, and also a consideration based on the local government. Yeah, there's not really much more I can provide on that. I don't know if Larry wants to jump in on that at all.
Okay, just unmuted myself. I'm going to have to take this one back to my colleagues and ask a few questions on that type of a basis. Sorry, I can't answer that right up now.
No, that's all right. And yeah, look, IAP is just a condition that can be applied. It's not one that has to be applied. And yeah, that is really a case-by-case basis, I suppose. Sorry, I can't provide any more information on that.
Yeah.
All good, Kieran. We've got one more question from Cameron, and they've asked, one of the questions that I'm challenged by are on low volume roads. How should the likelihood be considered when you have the contrary considerations of complacency of frequent users versus knowledge of road standard by these users?
That's a bit of a tricky question, and I might have to pass some of it off to Dave. But I guess in the guide we do provide information on those low order roads, and I guess that's a little bit of the intent of this guide, is to provide additional information in regards to that. In regards to, I guess, risk on those roads, it can be compared to higher order roads, but it is a bit of a difficult thing to do. Yeah, I guess my knowledge isn't 100% on that question, unfortunately. I might have to answer that offline, unless Dave has any additional comments that he wants to add.
Yeah, no, certainly. So there is a mention in the guide of giving consideration to, I guess, non-local users. So, and that's in recognition of seasonal traffic. The tourist road users with caravans. There is some signage that's suggested in the guide for those types of situations, and also just for an FYI for everyone, we have a current project that's just started this month that's looking into low volume roads and narrow 4-meter seals. So we'll be looking at developing some guidance, which will be passed on to TMR and then publish with how you sort of mitigate that risk for that low volume, infrequent passing of a heavy vehicle and a light vehicle, and that exact scenario where that road user is perhaps not expecting to come across a heavy vehicle.
Awesome, thanks, Dave. We might have to continue on with the last section of the presentation, as we've run out of time a little bit. But the next section is quite short, and then we'll open up for questions a little bit. Yeah. All right. So the last topic that we are going to discuss is traffic considerations. So this is looking at current vehicle compositions, and the current vehicle composition should be quantified and considered when undertaking any sort of route assessment. And it's also useful for the risk assessment process as well. So routes that already experience high proportions of heavy vehicles will generally have more driver familiarity and result in greater route acceptance. Conversely to this, routes with a higher tourist content, such as caravans or even just unfamiliar drivers, would have lower route acceptance due to considered safety risks, and this is around heavy vehicle access. So in some cases, signage can be used to mitigate some of these risks on road segments, and we've got some examples of heavy vehicle route signage there, where it's kind of identifying that there are certain types of heavy vehicles on that route, and I guess what unfamiliar road users should be doing when approaching approaching either from behind or from the front of those vehicles. And yeah, again, those can be used in a risk assessment process as well, to kind of mitigate certain risks. Again, and I think we already had some questions on this, crash history should be assessed to determine if there is a higher crash rate than other roads of a comparable class. Obviously, this isn't always possible, but in some cases you can kind of estimate if there would be crashes based on the road type and similar roads around the area. Typical metrics of crashes that are used are crashes per VKT, so vehicle kilometre travelled, and just crashes per kilometre of the road. When comparing the crash rate for each crash type, so we've got a sample road here. You can see that multi-combination vehicles have a higher crash rate for head-on crashes. Vehicles leaving driveways and out of control on curve crashes. So this identifies that a focus should be placed on those geometric attributes that may contribute to these types of crashes. So consultation may be done with the police to determine whether heavy vehicles would increase the risk, the existing risk, and vulnerable road users such as pedestrians, cyclists, or motorcyclists, should be considered. So in the example that we have there, each column shows the crash risk per 100 million vehicle kilometres travelled for each vehicle type over the same section of road. And this results in each crash rate being comparable. In other words, it accounts for the fact that heavy vehicles may account for a lower percentage of vehicles. When comparing the crash rates for each crash type on the sample road, you can see that multi-combination vehicles do have higher crash rates in quite a number of areas there. And yeah, it does identify that there should be additional considerations given to certain geometric attributes that may have an issue, may have an impact on that. So one of the things that we do mention in the guidelines is a proactive risk assessment. So this can be undertaken to identify risks on a route before a crash does occur, and it can be undertaken at any time. Really, it doesn't need to be if you're doing a route assessment. You can do this if you even just have any general concerns on a route. So this is advantageous as crash history does not always represent crash risk. An assessor should consider if any of the identified risks in a proactive assessment may increase if access to multi-combination vehicles is granted. And the Safe System Assessment Framework provides an easy-to-use framework to identify risks for key crash types. So that's another thing that was developed in the past as a Safe System Assessment Framework. And there is a bit of an example there on the right on what that is. So it's basically just looking at the influence or exposure of a crash. And the last thing that we're going to look at is just a bit of traffic volume data. So a majority of the guideline considers traffic volumes as a key input. So when you start using the guide, you'll see that a lot of the geometric assessment options really requires a volume to be used in part of that assessment. So current projected and seasonal traffic volumes should be considered. Traffic volumes can be considered as either annual average daily traffic, so AADT, or vehicles per day, which can be used to identify days during a week or days during a part of the year where traffic volumes are either low or very high, and when multi-combination vehicle access may be suitable. So we've got a little bit of an example on the right. So we've got the weekly pattern of traffic, where in certain months you can see that there is quite a large spike, and then in other months there is a bit of a drop off. So in that example, in about the June-July period, there is a higher volume of traffic, and it may not be the best idea to have MCVs on the road at that time. And then again, we've got intersection turn volumes, which should also be considered, particularly when a route being assessed is required to undertake, well, any sort of turn maneuver, but typically a right turn across a through road is the most concerning. If there is high volumes in the through direction and you've got vehicles trying to turn right, it's going to make it very difficult for the vehicle to turn right to start with. And then there's the other issue of if the vehicle does turn right and vehicles are coming towards them, is there enough sight distance for them to stop? So traffic volume throughout the whole process is quite important, especially those AADT values or vehicles per day. And in a lot of cases, you should be using, I guess, the highest AADT that occurs. So as an example, in that June-July period, that is the highest. So if you're looking at providing access at all periods of the year, that's the AADT that should be used, or the vehicles per day that should be used. If you are kind of conditioning it where you're saying that you can operate anytime except for those, then a lower AADT or a lower vehicles per day can be used to determine if access should be allowed. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this session. So I'll just open up for a few questions before we finish. I know we've run over time a little bit, but yeah, we'll try and answer as many questions as we can.
Thank you, Kieran. We've probably got time for one last question, and that is from Emily, and they have asked, what are the benefits of doing a proactive risk assessment versus undertaking a road safety audit?
Yeah, so I guess a road safety audit really provides the risks that you can actually use in a proactive risk assessment. So I guess there is a bit of crossover there. The road safety audit, I guess really just identifies risks that may be on that road, and then you can use the proactive risk assessment process using those risks that were already involved, that were already identified, and then treat those using the proactive risk assessment process. I guess that's what comes to my mind from that question. Dave, I don't know if you have any comment on that. I think that's, yeah, I think I cleared that up, hopefully.
Yeah, look, I think there is a potential there for it to be a bit of a grey area. I guess the key takeaway is that the road safety audit doesn't consider specific road attributes or traffic risks that are related to the performance of a heavy vehicle. So what its limitations are. I guess within the guide, it suggests that to do that proactive risk assessment, to identify those risks based on the road safety audit process, and then that identifies where, I guess when you're doing the route assessment itself, you can really hone in and focus on, well, this is a risk that we've identified purely from a safety perspective. Now, within the route assessment process, are we ensuring that this piece of infrastructure is going to be conducive to that risk that's been identified? So say, for example, if you identified that there was an intersection with reduced sight lines to vehicles approaching on the side road, and there was a couple of other contributing factors as well, such as signage wasn't clear, there was a pre-existing crash history. That's your proactive risk component. And then within your route assessment, there's clear guidance in there for assessing sight lines at intersections. So you would perhaps want to say, well, look, we've identified that this is a risk in our road safety audit or our safe system assessment framework. We've assessed the sight lines in accordance with the criteria, and we've identified that the sight distance available is exactly what's available within the guide. Now that's potentially not a suitable outcome, particularly if there's a history of crashes. So you may well say, well, what can we do to increase that sight line by 20 or 30%? And that's where the proactive risk assessment part really fits in. Just one example. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Dave. I think that provides a bit more clarity on I guess the difference between the two and where those overlaps are.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Kieran. If we could go to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So thank you to our presenters today, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. Our next NACOE webinar is on the 29th of July. Please check out our website. We have so much happening in the online space, and we'd love to have you join us with anything that might enhance your professional development and build your CPD points. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Isabella. And thanks, Larry and Dave, for joining us.
Pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure.